In 1914, a wooden ship sailed into the most hostile waters on Earth and vanished into the ice. For nearly 2 years, its crew would drift, freeze, starve, and gamble everything on a journey so improbable that survival bordered on impossible. Not a single rescue mission could reach them, and yet, against all logic, every man came home alive. At the dawn of the 20th century, Antarctica was the last blank space on the world map. Nations had raced to plant flags at the South Pole, chasing prestige as much as discovery. By 1911, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had claimed the prize, beating Britain's Robert Falcon Scott by a matter of weeks. Scott and his team perished on the return journey, turning triumph into tragedy and casting a long shadow over polar exploration. But one man refused to accept that the story was over. Sir Ernest Shackleton had already come close to the pole years earlier, pushing farther south than anyone before him. Now he envisioned something even more ambitious: the first land crossing of Antarctica, coast to coast, across the coldest, windiest, driest continent on Earth. It would be a journey of nearly 1,800 miles over unmapped ice, jagged mountains, and temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in seconds. To accomplish it, Shackleton purchased a sturdy wooden barquentine built for polar conditions. He named her Endurance, after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." In August 1914, as Europe slid into World War I, Endurance departed England. Shackleton had even offered to cancel the expedition and place his ship at the Admiralty. But the Admiralty responded with a simple message: proceed. Exploration, they believed, was still worth pursuing. After months at sea, Endurance reached the edge of the Antarctic pack ice in January 1915. At first, the ship threaded through floating floes with cautious optimism, but the ice grew thicker, denser, more relentless. By late January, the vessel was completely trapped, gripped by frozen ocean stretching to the horizon in every direction. There would be no sailing through. The sea itself had turned solid. Shackleton ordered the engine stopped. The crew watched as pressure ridges formed around them, towering slabs of ice grinding together with the deep groan of a living thing. The ship, built of thick oak and reinforced for polar travel, now faced forces strong enough to crush steel. Winter closed in. Darkness swallowed the Antarctic for months at a time. Temperatures plunged far below zero. The men settled into a strange routine, living aboard a ship that was no longer moving, drifting wherever the ice carried them. Shackleton understood the real danger wasn't just cold or hunger, it was despair. So he made morale his top priority. The crew held soccer matches on the ice. They staged concerts, lectures, even costume nights using whatever scraps they could find. Photographs from the expedition show men smiling beside snow sculptures as if they were on holiday rather than trapped at the bottom of the world. But beneath the surface, the ice was tightening its grip. By October 1915, the pressure became unbearable. Massive floes collided, squeezing Endurance from both sides. The hull began to buckle. Beams cracked like gunshots. Water seeped in faster than pumps could expel it. One crew member described the sound as the most terrible noise I have ever heard. Shackleton gave the order no captain ever wants to give: abandon ship. The men carried supplies onto the ice: tents, sledges, food, scientific equipment, 3 small lifeboats, and whatever personal items they could justify by weight. Then they watched as their home of nearly a year slowly died. The ice crushed the hull inward, splintering the timbers, until Endurance sank beneath the frozen sea. 28 men were now stranded on a drifting ice floe thousands of miles from civilization, with no communication, no rescue plan, and winter closing in again. Shackleton gathered them and laid out the new objective with brutal clarity. Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home. At first, they tried marching across the ice, dragging lifeboats on sledges in case they reached open water, but the terrain was a chaotic maze of pressure ridges, crevices, and slushy pools. Progress was agonizingly slow, sometimes less than a mile per day. After weeks of exhausting effort, Shackleton made another critical decision: stop moving. They established a camp on a relatively stable floe and waited for the ice itself to drift north toward warmer waters. It was a gamble, but any other option risked exhausting the men before they even reached the ocean. Life became a daily struggle for survival. They hunted seals and penguins for food and fuel, burning blubber in improvised stoves. Their clothing stiffened with ice. Frostbite was constant. Sleep came in short, shivering bursts. Yet Shackleton remained relentlessly positive. He rotated tent assignments to prevent cliques, shared rations equally regardless of rank, and made sure no one felt abandoned. When supplies dwindled, he quietly gave up his own portions. Months passed. The floe shrank and cracked beneath them. At night, they could hear the sea surging below, a reminder that their fragile platform might break apart at any moment.
Finally, in April 1916, the ice began to disintegrate completely. Jagged chunks drifted apart, opening dark channels of frigid water. The men launched their lifeboats and rowed for days through a nightmare of freezing spray, shifting ice, and exhaustion. Their destination was Elephant Island, a barren speck of land at the edge of the Antarctic Peninsula, one of the most remote places on Earth. When they finally staggered ashore, it was the first time in 497 days that any of them had stood on solid ground. But safety was an illusion. Elephant Island had no settlements, no passing ships, no reliable food source. If they stayed, they would eventually starve or freeze. Shackleton realized that rescue would never come unless he went to find it. The nearest inhabited outpost was on South Georgia Island, more than 800 miles away, across the most violent ocean on the planet. Between them lay the Drake Passage, infamous for towering waves and hurricane-force winds. Attempting the journey in a small open lifeboat bordered on madness. Yet Shackleton selected 5 volunteers and began preparing the strongest of the boats for the crossing. They reinforced it with scrap wood, added a makeshift deck to deflect waves, and packed minimal supplies to keep weight down. Before departing, Shackleton addressed the men who would remain behind. He promised he would return for them. Not if possible, when. On April 24, 1916, the tiny boat pushed into the vast gray ocean and disappeared into the mist. What followed was one of the greatest small boat voyages in history. For 16 days, Shackleton and his crew battled colossal waves that could swallow their vessel whole. Ice formed constantly on the deck, threatening to capsize them unless chipped away. Sleep was nearly impossible. Navigation relied on brief glimpses of the sun through cloud cover. Miss one reading, and they could drift hopelessly off course. At any moment, a single rogue wave could end everything. Against staggering odds, they sighted South Georgia Island. But the ordeal was not over. Storms forced them to land on the uninhabited side of the island, far from the whaling stations where help could be found. Between them and rescue lay a mountainous interior that had never been crossed. Most of the men were too weak to continue. Shackleton chose 2 companions for the final push, leaving the others with the boat. With no map,
No proper climbing gear, and only improvised boots, the three men began a non-stop trek across glaciers, crevices, and knife-edge ridges. They marched for 36 hours straight, knowing stopping could mean freezing to death. At one point, they slid down a mountainside on a length of rope, unable to see where it would end. Miraculously, they survived the descent. Finally, exhausted and unrecognizable after months of hardship, they stumbled into the Stromness whaling station. The manager reportedly didn't know who the ragged strangers were until Shackleton spoke. It had been nearly 2 years since Endurance sailed into the ice. Shackleton immediately organized rescue attempts for the men left on Elephant Island. But Antarctic weather proved merciless. Sea ice blocked the approach again and again. One ship after another was forced to turn back. Each failure meant more time for the stranded crew, more dwindling supplies, more uncertainty, more waiting. 4 months after Shackleton's departure, a Chilean vessel finally broke through the ice. As the ship approached Elephant Island, the crew rushed to the shore. They had maintained a constant watch, never allowing themselves to believe they had been forgotten. When Shackleton stepped onto the beach, he asked a single question: "Are you all well?" The reply came back: "All safe, all well." Not one man had been lost. In an era when polar expeditions routinely ended in mass casualties, the survival of all 28 crew members seemed almost miraculous. But it was not luck alone that saved them. It was leadership, decisive, adaptable, and deeply human. Shackleton had abandoned his original goal without hesitation when survival demanded it. He prioritized morale as much as logistics. He shared hardship rather than commanding from comfort. And perhaps most importantly, he never allowed hope to collapse, even when circumstances gave every reason for despair. The Endurance expedition is often remembered not for exploration, but for rescue, for turning a catastrophic failure into one of history's greatest survival stories. Today, the frozen continent still guards the wreck of Endurance beneath miles of ice and water, discovered only recently after more than a century hidden from human eyes. The ship that once symbolized bold ambition now stands as a monument to resilience. Because the true measure of the journey was never how far south they traveled or whether they crossed Antarctica at all. It was what happened when everything went wrong. In a place where nature holds absolute power, where plans collapse and technology becomes meaningless, survival depends on something far more fragile and far more powerful at the same time: the will to endure. And sometimes the greatest victories in history aren't about conquering new lands, but about bringing everyone home alive.